My name is Loretta Jean Whitfield, and I have lived 68 years on this earth without once believing I was the kind of woman anything dramatic would happen to. I was a retired postal clerk. I had worked the same counter at the same branch in Cincinnati for 31 years. I knew how to sort priority mail by zip code in my sleep. I knew which regulars wanted their stamps licked and which ones preferred the peel and stick. I knew the smell of that building, ink and cardboard, and something like old coffee that never quite went away, better than I knew the smell of my own kitchen. When my husband Leonard died 3 years ago this past November, I did what any 65-year-old woman does when the house gets too quiet. I got a part-time job, not because I needed the money. Leonard had left me comfortable enough. We had the house, paid off since 2009. We had his pension from the city, and my own Social Security had kicked in the year before he passed. No, I went back to work because I couldn't stand the sound of that refrigerator humming. I couldn't stand how the 6 o'clock news sounded in a room where no one else was going to answer back. A friend of mine from church told me about a position at a private medical billing company downtown, Hargrove and Associates. They processed insurance claims for a network of independent clinics, the kind of small practices that couldn't afford a full billing department of their own. The work was straightforward, data entry, mostly, cross-checking CPT codes against insurance submissions, flagging denials, forwarding appeals. Nothing glamorous, but it required focus, and focus was exactly what I needed. The hours were the thing, though. Because of server maintenance windows and end-of-day claim cutoffs, my shift ran from 3 in the afternoon until 10 at night. My daughter, who lives out in Westerville with her husband and my 2 grandchildren, nearly had a fit when I told her, "Mama, you're going to be coming home alone at 10 o'clock at night? Downtown?" I told her I was 65 years old, not 90, and that I had survived 3 Cincinnati winters before she was even born. She made me promise to take a rideshare both ways, never the bus after dark. I agreed, mostly to stop the conversation, so that's how I started taking Lyft home every night. And that's how I met the man I'll call my driver, because in the beginning that's all he was. His name was Wendell. The first night I got into his car, he said nothing beyond confirming my name and my destination. He drove a clean, dark grey Chevy Malibu. No air freshener dangling from the mirror, which I appreciated. There was a thermos in the cup holder and a worn Bible on the passenger seat, spine up, which I noticed but did not comment on. He was somewhere in his early 60s, I guessed. Grey at his temples, hands steady on the wheel. He drove the way men drive when they have been driving a long time, unhurried, deliberate, no unnecessary braking. I thanked him when I got out. He nodded. The second night I got him again. Same car, same quiet. I figured it was coincidence, but when it happened a third time in the same week, I asked about it. He explained that he had set a preference for airport direction rides in the evening, and my address happened to fall along that corridor. He wasn't assigned to me specifically, it just kept working out that way. By the second week, I had started bringing coffee, not for any particular reason. I worked late and I drank it to stay sharp, and one evening I made too much and poured the extra into a small travel mug I had in my desk drawer. When I got in the car, I handed it to him without thinking much about it. He looked at it for a moment like I had handed him something breakable. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't," I said. "It's just coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. If that's wrong, you can pour it out." He didn't pour it out. After that, it became a thing. I brought coffee on the nights I remembered, which turned into most nights. Sometimes I'd bring a little something extra. A piece of pound cake wrapped in foil. A bag of those butter cookies from the tin that I always bought too many of around the holidays. Nothing elaborate. Just the kind of things you bring when you want to acknowledge that another person exists. We talked a little more as the weeks went on. Not deeply, not right away, mostly about surface things, the traffic on I-71, whether the Bengals had any real shot that year. The way downtown Cincinnati had changed since I was young, All those new condos going up around the riverfront, where there used to be nothing but parking lots and the memory of factories. He told me he'd moved to Cincinnati from Dayton about 4 years prior. He'd worked in warehousing for most of his life, but a back injury had ended that, and after a period he'd rather not go into, he said he'd gotten his license and started driving. He liked it well enough. The solitude suited him. I didn't push him on what he'd rather not go into. I knew what that phrase meant. I'd said it myself when people asked how I was managing after Leonard. Some things you get around to in your own time, or you don't. It was somewhere around the 6th or 7th week when he mentioned, almost in passing, that he had a son he hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. I didn't say anything at first. I just let that sit there in the car between us. Then I asked how old the boy was. 34, he said. Not a boy, I know that. I still call him that in my head. I told him I understood. My daughter was 41, and I still sometimes thought of her as the child who used to fall asleep on the couch with her shoes on. He gave a small sound that might have been a laugh. Then he said the falling out had been over money, specifically over a period after his back injury when he had not been able to work and had borrowed from his son's savings account and had not told him he was doing it. His son had found out. The son's wife had found out. It had all gone very badly, and he had not been able to repair it since. I didn't offer advice. I had not been asked for any. I just said that sounded like a hard thing to be carrying, and he said yes, it was. And then we pulled up to my house, and he said good night, and I went inside, and that was that. I thought about him and his son all week. I worked in a medical billing office, so I was not someone who spent her days thinking about human drama. I thought about claim denials and incorrect modifier codes, and whether a procedure had been billed as an office visit when it should have been an outpatient service. I thought about the monthly audit report my supervisor wanted by the 15th. I thought about my own life, but Wendell and his son stayed with me. There was a night in late January. I remember because there had been ice on the roads, and my shift ran long because 2 of the other clerks had called out. When I came down the elevator and out through the lobby and got into his car, and I handed him his coffee, and instead of pulling away from the curb, he sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel. I asked if everything was all right. He said, "Miss Loretta Jean, I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't think I'm overstepping." I told him to go ahead. He said he'd been coming into the building to use the restroom on cold nights. Our lobby guard didn't mind. He'd asked permission, and over the past few weeks, he had noticed a man he didn't recognize sitting in a parked car outside our building. Not every night, but often enough to notice a dark green Ford Explorer always in the same spot across the street. "What was he doing?" I asked. "Nothing," Wendell said. "That's what bothered me, just sitting, watching the entrance." I asked how long. He said at least 3 weeks that he'd seen, maybe longer. I told him it was probably nothing. A security detail for one of the other companies in the building, an off-duty officer supplementing income. Any number of things. Wendell said yes, probably, but he'd noticed that the car was always there between 9 and 10, and it always left a few minutes after my building's shift change. He'd noticed because he was always early, and he sat in the same lot, and he paid attention to what was around him. I didn't know what to say to that. He pulled out then into traffic and drove me home without mentioning it again. I went inside, turned on my lights, and told myself it was nothing. But I looked out my front window before I went to bed. There was no car on my street that I didn't recognize. I kept looking, though, in the weeks that followed. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. I noticed the layout of my block differently, which neighbors had outdoor lights, which stretches of sidewalk were dark. I noticed that my next-door neighbor on the left, a man named Roy, who'd moved in about 8 months ago, kept unusual hours. His lights were on at 2 in the morning sometimes. His car was never in his driveway when I came home from work, but it was always there when I woke up. I hadn't thought much about Roy before. He was cordial enough. Early 50s, neatly kept. He'd helped me carry in groceries once back in the fall. He always waved from his driveway. But I started thinking about him differently once Wendell put that idea in my head. One evening in February, I was working late on an audit and I accidentally opened a folder on our network that I wasn't supposed to be in. It happened because someone had mislabeled a subfolder, and my file path brought me somewhere I didn't expect. I almost closed it immediately, but before I did, I saw my own name, not in a file about me, in a claims report. A flag notation. My employee ID number linked to a billing record that I had never touched, in a case I had never been assigned to. Someone had used my login credentials to access a patient record outside my authorization level, or someone had altered the access log to make it appear that way. I didn't say anything that night. I took a screenshot on my personal phone, which was against company policy and which I would not apologize for, and I closed the folder and I finished my shift and I went downstairs and got in Wendell's car. I didn't tell him what I'd found, I wasn't ready yet, but I asked him as casually as I could manage whether he'd seen the Green Explorer recently. He said yes. 2 nights ago he hadn't wanted to worry me. Has it ever followed us? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "It pulled out behind us once, about a month ago. I took a different way home. It didn't follow the new route." I asked why he hadn't told me. He said, "Because I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to scare you over something that might be nothing. But now I'm sure. It's not nothing." I sat with that for the rest of the ride. When we got to my block, he didn't turn down my street. He drove past the intersection and looped around to the next block over. I didn't ask why, I already knew. Roy's car was in my driveway, not parked on the street, in my driveway at 10:23 at night. Wendell said very calmly, "You are not getting out of this car." I agreed with him completely. He drove us to a Frisch's Big Boy about a mile away, the kind of place that was open all night and had bright fluorescent lights and a counter you could sit at. He ordered coffee. I ordered tea, which I never drink, because my hands needed something to do. I called my daughter from the parking lot first. She didn't pick up, which didn't surprise me, because it was almost 11 and she was likely asleep. I left her a message that said I was fine and not to worry, which was only half true. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I told them there was an unknown vehicle parked in my private driveway without my permission, and that I had reason to believe the driver had been surveilling my workplace. They sent a unit. Wendell drove me back 20 minutes later. The officer who met us at the corner of my block told me they'd found Roy in his car in my driveway. He'd said he was waiting for me to return a dish he'd lent me. He did not have any dish. The officer had asked him to move along, and he had, but she took his information and cross-referenced it and came back out to the street to tell me something that made my stomach go cold. Roy's last name was Pickman, his first name was Darrell, and Darrell Roy Pickman had a prior restraining order filed against him in Hamilton County, not by me, but by a woman in Norwood, whose name I didn't recognize, for a pattern of behavior that included following her home from work, interfering with her mail, and accessing her personal records. Accessing her personal records. I thought about the mislabeled folder. I thought about my employee credentials appearing where they shouldn't have been. I thought about the fact that I worked for a medical billing company, that I processed sensitive patient financial information every day, that my login gave access to claim records going back years. I don't know exactly what Darrell Pickman had been looking for, or what he thought I had, or whether he had targeted me specifically, or whether it was something else entirely. What I know is what the detective who was assigned to the case told me 3 weeks later, that they had found evidence on a device seized from his home, that he had accessed our company's system using a credential chain that passed through my login, that he had been doing it for several months, that the data he'd pulled appeared to relate to a specific patient whose claim history he had a personal financial interest in, an elderly relative whose assets were being held in a trust that was partially dependent on a disability claim determination. Insurance fraud. the old-fashioned kind, dressed up in modern tools. He needed information to support a fraudulent claim on behalf of a family member, and he had chosen me as his way in because I was his neighbor, because I was a woman alone, because he had calculated correctly that no one was watching out for me. He had not calculated on Wendell. I found out later, not from Wendell himself but from my daughter, who had gone full investigator mode by the time everything came out, that Wendell had written down the Explorer's plate number weeks before he said anything to me, that he had run it, or had someone run it, through a method I didn't ask about, and he didn't volunteer, that he had known the car was registered to an address 1 street over from mine well before that night. He had not told me because he didn't want to frighten me without being certain, but he had kept watching, every single night. When I asked him about it, he said something I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. He said, "Miss Loretta Jean, when someone brings you coffee for 8 weeks without being asked, you pay attention to what might harm them." I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, entirely. Daryl Pickman was charged with computer fraud, stalking, and identity-based access violations. His relative's fraudulent claim was denied and reviewed. I was cleared of any involvement. The IT audit confirmed that my credentials had been accessed remotely without my knowledge through a session token vulnerability that the company has since patched. My supervisor was apologetic in that particular way employers are when they suspect they might be liable for something. I took 2 weeks off and went to Westerville to stay with my daughter. I let my grandchildren teach me how to play a card game I didn't understand and eat breakfast at 9 in the morning for the first time in years. It felt like rest. Real rest, the kind I hadn't had since before Leonard died. When I came back, I called Wendell, not through the app. He had given me his personal number weeks earlier, in case I was ever running late. I used it now. I asked if he was free for lunch, not as a passenger and a driver, but as 2 people who knew each other. There was a pause, then he said yes. We went to a diner on Reading Road that I had been going to since I was 30 years old. I ordered the open-faced turkey sandwich. He ordered the soup. We talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with what had happened. About Cincinnati in the 1980s, about the post office, about his years in the warehouse, about his mother who had made the best sweet potato pie in Dayton and who had passed 4 years ago. At the end, I asked him whether he had thought about reaching out to his son. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup around in his hands. He said, "I think about it every day. I just don't know if he wants to hear from me." I told him that in my experience, the children who act like they don't want to hear from you are often the ones waiting the longest to hear from you. That sometimes people need the other person to go first, not because they're too proud, but because they're too hurt to move. He didn't say anything else about it that day, but about 6 weeks later, he called me, not about a ride, just to call. He said his son had come to Cincinnati. They had met at a park near the east side and talked for almost 3 hours. He said it wasn't fixed, and it wasn't going to be fixed quickly, but his son had said, and I could hear in Wendell's voice what it cost him to repeat this, and what it gave him to say it out loud. His son had said that he'd been wanting to hear from him for a long time. I told him I was glad. I meant it all the way down to my feet. I still work at Hargrove and Associates. I moved to the day shift after everything that happened, 8 to 4 normal hours, home before dark. I take the bus now, most days. But on Tuesday evenings I still order a lift, partly out of habit, and partly because I started a Tuesday night church choir rehearsal and it runs late. Sometimes I get Wendell, not always. The algorithm doesn't arrange things on purpose. But when I do, I bring coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, and he always takes it. If you are a woman living alone and someone you cannot name makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, listen to that. I am not someone who believed in intuition before. I believed in procedure and documentation and double-checking your work, but Wendell did not have a procedure. He had attention. He noticed things because he allowed himself to be present to what was in front of him, and what was in front of him for those 8 weeks was me. You cannot put a price on being seen. And you cannot know, when you hand someone a cup of coffee on a cold night in November with no reason except that it seemed like the right thing to do, what that small kindness will one day give back to you. I think about that a lot now. I think Leonard would have liked Wendell. He would have approved of the way the man drives. Unhurried, deliberate, no unnecessary braking. He would have said, that's a man who knows where he's going. I think, for the first time in a long time, so do I.